I proceeded to sit down at my desk and observe the time on my watch. It was just a few minutes before 4 p.m. In approximately an hour, I will proceed to my residence to commence the weekend. I consistently anticipate the advent of the weekend, yet this particular one is exceptional. Tomorrow, Saturday, marks the 20th anniversary of my nuptials with Katie. I was eager to escort my esteemed wife away for the weekend to engage in passionate intercourse at the lake house I had reserved. I retrieved the photograph of Katie that was positioned on my desk and studied it meticulously. It was a photograph she had presented to me many years ago. The inscription read, "To the love of my life, Tom." It was, of course, Thomas West Tom to my friends and family. Katie and I were in love in high school and married shortly after graduation. Katie insisted that we wait until our wedding day to have sex, stating that it would have made our honeymoon much more enjoyable. I must admit that she was correct. My parents were supportive and gave me a check for $100. My father informed me that the sum of $000 and the keys to the townhouse they were using as a rental property were to be mine. He explained that this was the first installment of a $5 million trust fund he had set up for me shortly after I was born. He added that I would receive a similar payment every year. He also informed me that he had established the foundation shortly after my biological mother died. I was aware that she had died shortly after I was born, but I did not inquire further. After I was born, I never pressed him about it. A year after her death, he remarried to the woman I knew as Mom. I considered enlisting in the military after high school but was rejected due to being diagnosed with diabetes as a child. It was kept under control through diet and a regimen of pills I took every day. However, I did not let it stop me from playing soccer or taking Katie, and I attended the same college. She aspired to become an educator, while I sought to emulate my father's footsteps into the realm of business. Our plans were thwarted when Katie became pregnant with our only child, Jim, just 6 months after our nuptials. She endured a particularly arduous labor and, at the recommendation of our physician, underwent a salpingectomy shortly after Jim's birth. She took time off from college to care for our son and returned after he started kindergarten. She received her teaching certificate and began working at a local elementary school. I graduated and began working for Ryder Industries as an accountant. I remember the day I informed my father about my new position at Ryder Industries. He inquired about the company's history, noting that Ryder Industries had been in business for almost 75 years and was a highly regarded entity. The company was an established manufacturing and logistics enterprise with a vast customer base across the country and an impressive portfolio with significant potential for growth. I informed my father that I was employed as an accountant, a position that offered a competitive salary and benefits package. He expressed pride in my achievements and wished me success in my career. I recall being somewhat taken aback by his response. It was evident from his comment that, although he was proud of me, there was another issue at hand. I was curious to inquire further, but I refrained. My father was not one to divulge information unless it was absolutely necessary, and I was aware that persisting with him would yield no results. This prompted my decision to leave the business. The subsequent 16 years were, for want of a better term, uneventful. We worked, came home, and took care of our family. This was a cyclical process: eat, work, repeat. There was minimal travel, except for the occasional seminar. However, we did take time off for an annual vacation, usually during the summer months when Katie didn't have to work. I stopped taking martial arts classes about 5 years after I got married due to a lack of time. Additionally, I was raising a child, which further limited my availability. The combination of work and domestic responsibilities often results in this phenomenon. I did not frequently discuss my employment, but my father repeatedly suggested that I consider alternative options. I was curious about his motivation for suggesting this, but I ultimately refrained from pursuing the matter further. Katie and I were generally content. Of course, we experienced the typical challenges and fluctuations that arise in any marriage, but our personal lives were, on the whole, satisfactory. Our lives were fairly stable, though they did decline somewhat as we grew older. However, approximately 1 month ago, I began to observe some changes in Katie. Initially, I attributed these changes to the fact that she had completed her studies and no longer had to attend work on a daily basis. She experienced periods of withdrawal and distance, and on a few occasions, she was somewhat harsh with me. I was perplexed by her behavior and unsure of how to respond. Upon inquiring about the matter, She dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand and proceeded to walk away. Some time later, she returned and apologized for her behavior. Around this same time, I was informed that I was being considered for the vice president position that had recently become available. I was told that I was one of 2 individuals applying for this position. I later learned that the other candidate was the individual under consideration was Alex Marlowe. Alex was a commendable individual who merited a promotion, yet I believed I was better suited for the position. I chose to refrain from disclosing the promotion, opting to wait until I had ascertained the outcome with certainty. I did not perceive the promotion to be a contributing factor. However, it subsequently occurred to me that a significant transformation was occurring within the household. Jim had recently graduated from high school, and he was appointed to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He was, in fact, on his way there at that moment. Perhaps I thought she was worried about the prospect of becoming lonely. That's when I conceived the idea of a weekend away to celebrate our anniversary. I decided to surprise her, hoping that it would lift her spirits. The telephone on my desk rang at 4:15. This prompted me to return to the present. I picked up the phone and was greeted by the voice of my secretary, Mr. West. She informed me that Mr. West Henderson had called and requested my immediate presence. I thanked her and proceeded to the elevator. On my way up, I pulled my smartphone out of my pocket. Jacob Henderson, III, or Jake, as he preferred, was the CEO of Ryder. When he demanded my presence, I did not keep him waiting. I surmised that he wanted to discuss a promotion. I retrieved the audio recording device from my pocket and enabled the cord function for an hour, just in case I missed something important during the meeting. I put the phone back in my pocket just as the elevator reached the 15th floor, which housed the company's top executives. I proceeded to the Henderson suite, which occupied most of one end of the floor. His assistant, an attractive brunette named Brenda Harris, looked up at me as I entered. "Mr. Henderson is expecting you, Mr. West," she said with a slight grin. I was curious about the reason for this meeting. I was compelled to inquire as to the cause of the smirk and the nature of the situation. I proceeded to enter the office, where I was greeted by Henderson with a smile and an invitation to sit in the chair opposite the door. A sofa and coffee table were situated at one end of the office. "Please get Mr. West something to drink," he ordered, directing his attention to Harvey Strauss, a large man in a suit. I was aware that Strauss was one of Jake's personal guards and was curious about the whereabouts of the other guard. Henderson typically had 2 guards present. For reasons that remain unclear, I have heard rumors over the years, but none of them have ever been confirmed. Harvey poured some bourbon into a glass and handed it to me. I did not drink very often, but Harvey was aware that I preferred straight bourbon, just like my father. I accepted the drink. I thanked him and accepted the glass. Harvey nodded but did not respond verbally or even smile. In fact, I do not believe I have ever observed this man smile. Henderson proceeded to walk over to the sofa and sit down. I noted that he had removed his jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his shirt. Henderson was a large man with a barrel chest and muscles. He appeared to be in good physical condition for a man over the age of 50. He took a sip of his drink, then set it on the coffee table and regarded me for a moment before speaking. He then said, "Go on," with a smile. "Drink something. It won't kill you if you do. You may relax somewhat." I took a brief sip of the bourbon before placing the glass on the coaster he had on the coffee table. "Thank you," I said. "What can I do for you today, Mr. Henderson?" Jake smiled before responding. "That's what I like best about you, Tom," he said. "You're always so polite." He was remarkably kind. "I was discussing with Brenda a couple of days ago that I don't believe I've ever observed you to be concerned about anything. Could you please elaborate on the situation at home? Is everything satisfactory between you and your wife?" I nodded affirmatively and replied that everything is fine. Our son recently departed for West. I was planning on taking Katie out this weekend to celebrate our 20th anniversary, married for 20 years. Jake inquired as to whether I had something to celebrate. I assured him that I did not call to engage in idle chatter, rather, I wished to discuss a matter of importance. As you are aware, the forthcoming promotion is only open to you and Marlowe. The board requires 1 or 2 additional items before making a decision. "I see. Could you please elaborate on what the board requires?" "They wish to ascertain your flexibility." Jake stated, How do you react to stressful situations? To what extent are you willing to go to achieve the company goals? Do you understand that when you become a manager, your workday will not end at 5 as it currently does? I assumed that was accurate, at least to some extent. I said, I believe the board has reviewed my reviews and my personal file. Undoubtedly, they have. Jake said, but they require further evidence of your ability to respond effectively in challenging situations. I apologize, Mr. Henderson, but I'm afraid I don't fully comprehend. He smiled and took another sip of bourbon. You will understand this, my boy. He said, tell me, how strong is your marriage is very solid, Mr. Henderson, I said, taking another sip of my drink. Why are you asking? I'm glad to hear it, he replied. If your marriage is as strong as you say, I'm sure your wife will understand. He looked at Harvey and nodded slightly. Harvey walked to the other door, opened it, and came back to stand behind my chair. I felt a little uncomfortable about this and wondered what was going to happen. Then I saw another. Guards Lenny Jameson and Katie entered the room. Jameson led her to Henderson and stepped back. I was taken aback by her attire, a mini dress with an open back, revealing her waist, and a hemline just a few inches above her buttocks. She made eye contact with me but did not seem to recognize me. I observed her face and noted her eyes. Katie's appearance suggested the possibility of drug-induced impairment. I observed what seemed to be a white substance in her right nostril. I inquired about her presence and attire. She did not respond, her eyes appearing glassy, indicative of drug-induced altered consciousness. I redirected my attention to Henderson, seeking clarification. I reiterated my question about her presence in this outfit, emphasizing the apparent drug-induced impairment. Henderson responded with a laugh, suggesting he found my line of questioning amusing. He then posed a rhetorical question, asking me to speculate on her actions. Indeed, I administered a substance that I had prepared, which caused her to become hot, wet, and pliable, and to remain in this state for an extended period of time. I even administered 3 times the usual dose. He nodded to Lenny, who untied the strip of fabric from the back of her neck, releasing her breasts. Henderson reached out and pinched one of her breasts. Katie did not respond. I attempted to rise, but found that I was unable to move my arms or legs. It then became apparent to me what was occurring. Additionally, Harvey had also administered a substance to my beverage. Henderson then directed his attention to me, displaying an expression that indicated malevolence. He then turned his gaze to Lenny, who was situated behind Katie. Lenny proceeded to unfasten her dress, which cascaded down her body, leaving her in her high heels. Katie was now entirely unclothed. She remained motionless. I prefer my female partners to be shaved, he stated. Are you not her partner? I inquired, somewhat agitated. He responded, oh, now I perceive your concern. He then elaborated, we're just getting. He began, extending his hand and tracing a finger along her buttocks. Get the __ away from my wife, I interjected, my voice rising in agitation. Harvey restrained me with a firm grasp, while Henderson regarded me with a taunting smile. Or what? He inquired, his tone laced with menace. Will you assault me if I haven't made an error in my calculations? You're unable to move, even a muscle. Get away from her, I growled, my anger mounting. Henderson laughed again, his eyes glinting with malice. He unzipped his pants and dropped his trousers and boxers, gesturing for Lenny to the large man, then proceeded to push Katie to her knees in front of Henderson. This was followed by the woman's apparent satisfaction of the man's sexual desires, which then resulted in sexual intercourse. Throughout this ordeal, Katie's eyes remained glazed over as she moaned in pleasure, indicating that her focus was solely on the sexual act and that nothing else mattered to her. I was overcome with rage and struggled to free myself from Harvey's grasp. However, despite my efforts, I remained unable to move my arms. I then turned my attention back to Henderson and shouted, I am going to kill you. He regarded me with a smirk. Is it truly feasible to converse with one's own flesh and blood in such a manner? He inquired. In the presence of your esteemed spouse, she will not remain my wife for much longer. I retorted angrily. What, precisely, do you imply by flesh and blood? He pressed. I was informed that you were previously unaware of this information. I informed him that my father had impregnated my biological mother in the presence of her husband. Henderson responded with a grin. Indeed, West, you and I are half-brothers. That is not accurate, I stated, taken aback. Why are you doing this? For several reasons, he replied. Firstly, as the general director, I have the authority to make decisions without oversight. I believe this is what is known as executive privilege. Secondly, I have long desired to interact with my younger half-brother. I am certain you did not join the company based on your academic qualifications or professional abilities. You must realize that I initiated this. I did, he confirmed. I was acquainted with your biological mother's husband when he was employed by my father's company. At the time, I was relatively young. The man had not even completed high school. He had worked at the company during the summers and weekends, primarily in the post office. He had gradually advanced in the company and now occupied the same position as his father. He had kept an eye on the subject and, upon learning of his college graduation, had informed him that he would be hired if he applied for a position at the company. The subject had been planning this for some time, he replied. He described his strategy as a long-term one. He had been aware that this would eventually occur and that it was simply a matter of time. Consequently, your assets are now under my control, as is your wife's. This brings me to the third reason for my actions. I intend to reclaim what was taken from my father. I inquired as to the nature of the taking in question. I have never met your father, but the men you referred to as Dad initiated legal proceedings against my father and the company. From where, if I may ask, did the funds for your trust fund originate? I am now seeking to reclaim what is rightfully mine, and I intend to do so by taking it from your wife. I inquired as to whether he would be amenable to a negotiated settlement. He responded with a shrug, indicating a lack of interest in further discussion. Therefore, I will proceed with the next steps in the litigation. Tom, you are not going to divorce your wife. She will require additional funds to support her new lifestyle, as previously discussed. She now belongs to me, and she will become my personal, corporate, and available girlfriend. You will never have contact with her again. She will be available to me upon request, 24/7. In fact, I am taking her to New York for a couple of days to present her to the board of directors. They also expressed interest. In her, there is no cause for concern. I shall return it, perhaps in a somewhat disheveled state. Yuk never succeeds in evading accountability for his actions. I informed him that he had already done so, and that there was no possibility of preventing him from doing so again. He then directed his attention to Lenny and nodded his head in agreement. Lenny advanced to stand in front of me and smiled. This is not a personal attack on you, Mr. West, he said. I am simply carrying out my duties in accordance with these instructions. He then struck me with considerable force in the face. I experienced a loss of consciousness after the third blow. When I regained consciousness, I found myself. I promptly discerned that I was situated within a hospital room. I heard the sounds of machinery and observed the plastic intravenous line attached to my arm. My mouth was parched, and my head was pounding. I surveyed my surroundings and noticed my father seated in the chair adjacent to my bed. He heard me move and turned to look at me. His demeanor suggested that he had not slept in an uninterrupted fashion for an extended period. He observed that I was attempting to vocalize and summoned the nurse. A young woman in a nurse's uniform subsequently entered the room and assessed my vital signs. Prior to providing me with a piece of ice to suck on, she gave me another one after the first one melted. After consuming a few more cubes, I licked my lips and attempted to speak. I inquired as to the duration of my hospitalization. My father informed me that I had been here for approximately 4 days. I was shocked to learn that this meant that it was Tuesday. He explained that I had received a call from the hospital late on Friday evening. They had informed him that I had been brought to the emergency room and had not returned home since then. What happened to you, son? I inquired, noting the doctor's entrance into my room. Good afternoon, Mr. West. I'm Dr. Pierce, he replied. I'm glad to see you with us again. How do you feel? It's as if I was run over by a truck, I responded. Everything hurts. You've been pretty beat up, he stated. Nothing is broken, but you have a couple of bruised ribs and a small bruise. We were concerned that you might have had a concussion. He proceeded to examine me and take notes on my medical map. "We're going to take some X-rays," he said. I consulted with Dr. Pierce and requested that he keep me hospitalized for one additional night for observation. "If everything goes well, we can send you home tomorrow." I also contacted the police, as I believed that you were under attack and that we had a responsibility to report possible criminal activity. "I know they want to talk to you. Do you think you can handle this?" "Yes, doctor. I will be able to." Upon returning to my room, I observed a man in a suit engaged in conversation with my father. After I had settled in, the man in the suit produced a set of identification cards and introduced himself as Mr. West. He then inquired as to whether I could provide information regarding the incident. I replied in the affirmative and proceeded to recount the events in detail. At this point, I was prompted to recall whether I had left my phone in the room. I confirmed that I had not, and then inquired about the whereabouts of the phone. My father informed me that my mother had brought the charger and connected the device to the outlet. I surmised that you might require this. He deactivated the mobile phone, which was positioned on the table adjacent to my bed, and then transferred it to me. I observed the presence of several text messages from a few unidentified numbers and resolved to examine them at a later point in time. I located the audio recording that I had created and initiated its playback for the detective. We could discern the entirety of the audio, including the impact of the blows inflicted upon my body. I paid particular attention to the events that transpired subsequent to my assault. In the audio recording, we heard Henderson instructing the two guards to take him out the back door and take him to the hospital. He then added, "If anyone asks, just say that's how you found it." We also heard Lenny's voice, followed by what seemed to be movement, probably from the guards who were dragging me. After that, we heard them talking as they pushed me into the back seat of the car. Harvey said, "I don't want to get blood on the seats. I'm trying, but he's such a son of a ... Lenny replied, "Aren't they?" Harvey stated that the subsequent events were similar. We then heard the door of the vehicle being closed, after which the recording ceased. Video footage from the hospital's security system revealed that the perpetrators drove up, opened the door, and threw the victim into the parking lot before driving away. A couple of EMTs observed the victim lying there and took him inside. The vehicle's license plate indicates that it is registered to Ryder Industries. On Monday morning, I contacted your Human Resources Department to inform them of your location. They informed me that Henderson had already stated that you would be on sick leave for a week. My father, who was aware of the situation with Katie, told me that he did not believe this to be true. I have been attempting to contact you via telephone at your residence and on her cellular device since receiving the call from the hospital. I have left voicemails, but have not received a response. It is likely that she is still in New York. I have expressed my concern that she may be subjected to mistreatment. I will add her to the wanted list. Ryan inquired if I had a recent photograph of her. Yes, there is. I will send the photograph to the NYPD and request that they do the same. I will also issue a warrant for the arrest of Henderson and his associates and forward it to the NYPD. I assume you want us to proceed with these steps. Press charges. That is correct. Then we will determine the appropriate course of action without your involvement. Mr. West, I advise you to refrain from further involvement and allow the professionals to handle the matter. Thank you, Detective. We will be in touch. I must inquire as to whether there are any additional details that I should be aware of following Henderson's departure from the room. I informed my father that I was unsure if I had heard everything. He confirmed that Henderson had indeed made a full disclosure. However, he also revealed that there were two additional pieces of information that Henderson had not shared. The first was that Henderson's biological father had engaged in sexual intercourse with Henderson's mother. The second was that Henderson had been forced to watch this act. However, it was not until after the event that Henderson discovered that his mother was already pregnant. I was not aware of the full extent of the situation at the time. After the incident occurred, I filed for divorce. He stated that she repeatedly asserted that it was merely an error and that she still held feelings for me. However, I was unwavering in my resolve and refused to engage with her. I relocated to the guest bedroom and demanded a complete separation. Additionally, I filed a lawsuit was filed against Henderson and Company for allowing this to occur. In the early stages of the case, I could still take legal action soon after my wife discovered she was pregnant. However, the court ordered us to wait until our child was born before proceeding with the case. I requested that you take a DNA test. You were born in 1982. Prior to the advent of DNA paternity testing, blood tests were employed to establish paternity. However, these tests yielded inconclusive results. It was subsequently determined that you, your biological mother, and Henderson shared the same blood type. The specifics of this are beyond the scope of this discussion. However, it is important to note that the situation within the household has deteriorated. Your biological mother began to abuse alcohol and substance abuse. She died of an overdose approximately 6 months after your birth. I continued the lawsuit against Henderson and Ryder and settled it out of court. My father stated that the proceeds from the settlement funded the establishment of your trust fund. As part of the agreement, I agreed to refrain from disclosing any details about this case. I am unable to provide any further details at this time. Approximately 1 year later, I met Patricia. She developed an immediate attachment to you upon first seeing you. Following our marriage, she expressed a strong desire to adopt you. Despite being unable to have children of her own, she considered you to be her son. How did you become aware of this? I inquired of your son whether he recalled the motorcycle accident he had been involved in at the age of 16. He replied that he did indeed remember it. One day, I was riding on the back of Jimmy Reardon's bike. He was usually very careful, but on that day, he hit a slippery spot on the road, and we fell. Fortunately, we were both wearing helmets, which protected us from serious injury. The accident resulted in significant physical trauma, yet I retained some degree of recollection. I distinctly recall requesting that the hospital perform a DNA test. He asserted that I was driven by a need to ascertain the truth, regardless of the circumstances. The test results indicated that there is a greater than 99% probability that I am your biological father. This implies that your biological mother was already pregnant with you when Henderson had her. As far as I am concerned, you are my father, regardless of the results of any test. I informed him, which elicited a smile. I then asked him about the circumstances surrounding Henderson. He informed me that Henderson had died of a stroke around the time you went to college. He also stated that his son had become general director. I had hoped that the younger Henderson had learned from his father's mistakes, but it appears I was mistaken. This is why you were not particularly enthusiastic about me going there to work. Is this correct? I asked. He nodded his head in affirmation. He said he wanted to tell you, but he couldn't. I pray to God that I have this now. It's not your fault. It was an unfortunate turn of events. I must admit, I am perplexed by the circumstances surrounding Katie's decision to engage in a romantic relationship with him after such a significant period of time. It is difficult to comprehend how she could have made such a choice. It appears that she may have been drugged, which raises further questions. However, there seems to be more to this story than meets the eye. I would like to understand the context in which she was present and why she was wearing that particular outfit. Brenda entered the room, her demeanor meek and submissive. She inquired if she could come in, holding a vase full of flowers and a large card. She explained that she had brought the flowers and card to express her regret. In the office, several colleagues contributed to the purchase of the item, which they also signed. "Thank you, Brenda," I said, indicating the location of the flowers. She placed the flowers on the nightstand next to the bed and handed me a card. She then turned to face me. "I want you to know that I'm really sorry about," she began. She proceeded to inform me of the following: "Did you know what Henderson was planning to do?" I responded in the negative. She then stated, "I didn't know about this," and indicated her awareness of my lack of knowledge by pointing at me. I then inquired as to the specifics of the incident. She replied, "That morning, he provided me with a company credit card and instructed me to retrieve your wife. He informed me that he was waiting for me. He instructed me to take her out and purchase the shortest, most revealing dress we could find and take her downstairs to get her hair done. He also insisted that she wax her bikini area. This was a complete Brazilian wax." I had a fairly good idea of what he meant. This was not the first time he had done this. Therefore, your boss as the man in question was attempting to train his own daughters using Brenda as a guinea pig. The woman's face turned red, and she had the good sense to look down. She informed her father that he had drugged her. He also drugged all the women he slept with, including Ms. West. He enjoys experimenting with drugs. Has he ever used this particular drug on you? The woman nodded her head in affirmation. One day, she said, he informed me that the dosage was only a quarter of the usual amount, which resulted in a duration of approximately an hour. I inquired about the quantity he had administered to my wife. She shook her head in negation and stated that she was unaware of the specific amount. He had, however, administered 3 times the usual dose to Katie. My wife's eyes widened in response to this revelation, and she brought her hands to her face in a gesture of shock. Your wife must have been in a state of arousal for an extended period of time. It is likely that she was unaware of your presence in the room. This substance has a pronounced effect on the body. When I entered your office, you were aware of what was about to occur. I inquired, and she nodded her head in affirmation. I was aware of this, but I was unprepared for the manner in which he would treat you. I inquired as to the current whereabouts of Henderson and my wife. The last I had heard, they were still in New York. She replied that I should agree to speak with the police. I will do everything in my power to help, she said, her eyes reflecting tears. I am truly sorry about this, Mr. West. There is just one more thing. Brenda, I inquired as to the nature of the situation. I then asked if my wife was aware of what was to transpire. She indicated that she was. I then asked if she had any knowledge of Mr. West's intentions. She replied that she believed she was aware of them. I then asked if she had any knowledge of Mr. Henderson's actions. She stated that she was aware of his repeated attempts to contact her, including several dinner invitations and lengthy lunches. However, she was uncertain as to the specifics of their interactions. If they did anything, and he never informed me, do you believe they were involved? I inquired. I would posit that it is highly probable, though I am uncertain. She replied that she often engages in such activities for Henderson. Do you approve of his actions? He asked. She shook her head. You are mistaken. I am a single mother with a special needs child. Mr. Henderson compensates me handsomely for my assistance. Your silence, young lady, is what led to my son's hospitalization this time. I am beginning to lose my temper. She retreated as he glared at her. Mr. West, I informed him that I was unaware of any intention to harm your son. Had I been aware, I would have warned him. The father then leaned back in his chair and looked at her without saying anything. He then instructed me to contact the police detective about this matter. I advised her that it would be advisable for her to be available and to cooperate fully. She nodded her head in understanding. I understand, Mr. West, she said. I will convey your gratitude for the flowers and the card to everyone. I will do so, she replied, wiping a tear from her eye. I apologize with these words, she said, turning and leaving the room after the door closed. That explains something, I said to my father. Since the conclusion of the academic year, Jim's behavior has exhibited some peculiarities. Initially, I attributed this to the transition to West Point. However, I am confident that we will soon ascertain the root cause. The doorbell rang once more, and a hospital orderly entered, bearing a cart laden with food. My father's demeanor brightened, and he rose from his seat. It appears that it is time for dinner. He stated that it would be prudent for me to return home before my mother sends the National Guard to search for me. He made a jest of it, urging me to take care of myself, get some rest, and we would see each other in the morning. I thanked him, informing him that I would relay a message to my mother and ensure that she was aware of my love for her. He replied that he would do the same, and, in addition, stated that he loved me. He smiled as we shook hands, and then departed the room. The orderly smiled at my father as he left and then placed my food on the tray. The food actually smelled quite appetizing, and I was somewhat hungry since it had been several days since I had eaten. I consumed the food rapidly, enjoying the meatloaf and mashed potatoes. I especially liked the mushroom sauce, however, it did not meet the standards set by my mother or Katie. Nevertheless, it was satisfactory. I even enjoyed the broccoli, which I typically avoid. I had finished my pudding cup. As I was sipping my coffee, I decided to check my phone for text messages. There were 4 messages in total, each of which had a video attachment. The first message, dated later that Friday, simply read, "Enjoy. I bet you wish you weren't here." I did not recognize the number and opened the video. I immediately regretted doing so, as the video began with Katie standing in front of a group of men, all of whom were grinning, and wearing the same short dress she was wearing the last time I saw her. I recognized these men as members of the board of directors. This would only add millions to the lawsuit. I thought to myself that she stood silently as one of the men reached out, tore off her dress, and threw it on the floor. She began to satisfy the men. I observed that Katie's eyes were still glazed over, indicating that she was under the influence of the substance provided by Henderson. I was uncertain as to whether this was due to the substance he had given her on Friday afternoon or if he had provided her with another. Fortunately, the video concluded before I was overcome with nausea. I summoned the courage to open the subsequent message, dated early Saturday morning, and play the video. In this video, Katie was engaged in sexual activities with multiple men. The third video, from late Saturday night, depicted Katie in a supine position with her legs widely separated, and she was sexually penetrated by several men. The fourth video was distinct. It was dated early Sunday morning. The subsequent video depicted Henderson and Katie directly addressing the camera. Her eyes appeared bloodshot, and dark bags were visible beneath them. It was unclear how long she had been subjected to such treatment. Henderson spoke first, stating, "I hope you enjoyed what you saw, cockle." He then turned to Katie and said, "Tell that, __, who I am, honey." She responded in a monotone voice, stating, "Jake Henderson is my master." "That is true," he said, addressing the emotion. "What is your new role, Henderson?" "I am my master's naked sex toy," she replied. "I engage in sexual activity with whomever, whenever, and however he desires. I am at his disposal as much as he desires." "That is excellent," Jake said. "Tell that, __, that he will never touch you again. You will never be able to touch me again." "You will never be able to touch me again," Henderson agreed, turning to the camera. "Do not rock the boat. The next time I request that Harvey and Lenny engage in conversation with you, you may not regain consciousness. I will see you later." This video concludes. I experienced a plethora of emotions, including hatred, anger, sadness, and disappointment. I was incredulous about what I had just witnessed and heard. It appeared that he had successfully seduced her. I observed the wedding ring on my finger and realized that it no longer held any significance for me. Consequently, I removed it and discarded it on the nightstand. Perhaps I considered selling it and obtaining a modest sum in return. At that moment, I was certain that I would divorce Katie. I was indifferent to Jake's opinion. I also intended to hold him financially liable. However, I was perplexed by the prospect of alienation of affection lawsuits, given that my father had filed for divorce. Nevertheless, I was driven to seek retribution against the individual in question. I contacted Ryan and informed him about the videos and Henderson's threats. He requested that I forward them to him and stated that he would contact me. I complied with his instructions. I followed his instructions and turned off my phone. I contemplated contacting Kathy, but ultimately decided against it. I placed my phone on the nightstand and watched some television to distract myself from the disturbing images I had just witnessed. Eventually, I fell asleep, dreaming of happier times with my former wife. The following morning, I woke up to the sounds of nurses in my room checking my vital signs and monitoring my condition. 2 of them escorted me to the radiology department for further examination. Subsequently, I underwent additional X-rays and was subsequently returned to my room. Once I had recovered my footing, the orderly transported me to the radiology department, where Dr. Pierce informed me that the procedure had been completed successfully and that I was cleared to return home. He provided a prescription for pain medication and outlined a series of instructions. He also recommended that I contact my parents to arrange for their assistance in transporting me home. "Once they arrive, you will be well. Take care of yourself, and I request that you schedule an appointment with your regular physician within a week." "Thank you, doctor." "I will do so," I informed him. I contacted my parents to convey the positive developments. Approximately an hour later, they arrived in my room. My mother embraced me, and I observed tears in her eyes. "Oh, Tom, I am so sorry this occurred," she said. "How do you feel?" "I am better," I replied. "Well, I prepared some of my lasagna for you," I told her. She suggested that I place it in the oven to keep it warm. I informed her that I had developed a fondness for my mother's lasagna, which was renowned for its intricate layers of cheese, mushrooms, and meat. I regarded her with a smile and expressed gratitude. "Thank you, Mom." I conveyed that her lasagna consistently elicited a positive emotional response, and I was grateful for its ability to brighten my day. She proceeded to share that my father had informed her of the incident and expressed remorse. I observed that she had every reason to discipline the woman in question, but I was relieved to see that she had chosen not to do so. My father and I exchanged glances. We exchanged glances and laughed. I was certain that she would have spanked Katie if she had been present, so I inquired whether there was any news. I informed my father about the videos and Henderson's threat video. My mother interjected, urging me to trust her. I replied that the videos were more than just problematic, they were egregious. I then suggested that she might want to seek legal counsel, given the gravity of the situation. My father concurred, adding that he would also like to speak with Jim. Be heartbroken. Okay, I'll make a few calls. Just then, a nurse came into the room and handed me discharge papers and instructions. They insisted that I ride in a wheelchair, so the nurse sat me down and wheeled me around while Mom and Dad walked next to me. We arrived at the loading dock, and I climbed into the back seat. Dad drove us back to my house, stopped at a pharmacy along the way so I could buy my pain pills, and I noticed my car was parked in the driveway when we pulled in. Upon arrival, your mother and I retrieved your vehicle from Ryder on Saturday. Your father informed me that Katie's vehicle remains in the garage. We proceeded to enter the house and observed a notable absence of personal items. I detected the aroma of lasagna in the oven, which provided a sense of familiarity and comfort. Yesterday afternoon, I took the liberty of rearranging some items to enhance the ambience. Your mother expressed concern about the potential for the space to become musty, and I agreed that a refresh was necessary. I expressed my gratitude for all that your mother has done. I believe I can handle all of this. However, at that moment, we observed the presence of a dark sedan parked in front of the house. I observed Ryan exit the vehicle on the driver's side, accompanied by another man in a suit who exited on the passenger side. I proceeded to open the door and extend an invitation for them to enter. "Please come inside," I said. I held the door open as two men entered. Ryan greeted me with a handshake as he entered. I proceeded to introduce him to my mother, and they shook hands. "Can I get you two something to drink?" my mother inquired. "Coffee, please," Ryan replied. "Coca-Cola," my mother responded. Ryan declined the offer of a beverage, stating that he preferred not to drink cola. He then introduced the other men, Mr. West, to Detective Hawthorne of the New York Police Department's Homicide Division. Initially taken aback, I eventually extended my hand, which Hawthorne accepted. I then invited them to take a seat. We proceeded to sit down and make ourselves as comfortable as possible. Detective Hawthorne then presented him with the photograph, which he held out for my inspection. I looked up and saw Katie's face, but her eyes were closed and her skin had a sickly tint. I inquired as to whether he could identify the woman in the photograph. "My wife, Kathy," I replied, "but she was alive early Sunday morning." "Did your wife have any marks or tattoos?" asked Hawthorne. "Yes," I answered. "She had a tattoo of a small dolphin on her upper right thigh." "Was it done as a dare?" "Yes," I said. 15 years ago. Hawthorne looked at Ryan and nodded his head before. "In retrospect, I must inform you, Mr. West, that there is a possibility that your wife may have been the victim of homicide." I inquired as to whether this attack would constitute sufficient evidence to classify her death as murder. Hawthorne responded that, based on his experience, the discovery of the body in a shallow grave in the center of Central Park yesterday afternoon indicated murder. "We are currently awaiting the results of the toxicology tests, which may provide further insight into the circumstances surrounding the incident." I proceeded to recount the entire incident to the detectives, and Ryan listened attentively, taking notes. Despite his familiarity with the details, I felt it was important to provide a comprehensive account. I then proceeded to play the audio recording and subsequently the video for their reference. I informed them that my mother had not witnessed or heard anything unusual. She began to weep. Her father removed her from the room so that I could converse with the detectives privately. Once they had concluded their viewing of the video, I informed them of the information that Brenda had conveyed to me. They both took notes and exchanged glances before turning to me. This provides an explanation for the bruises and the general condition of Mrs. West's body. Hawthorne said. He then turned to me and inquired as to whether the woman in question was working that day. As far as I am aware, she was not. Hawthorne then asked Ryan, who nodded in agreement, whether he could tell him anything about the drugs that Henderson had mentioned. He inquired about the drug super ecstasy, requesting only that I reiterate what Brenda had told me and what I had observed. I informed him that the substance used on me had already been expelled from my system. However, I was uncertain about the whereabouts of Henderson and his associates. Ryan then revealed that Henderson's corporate jet had departed from New York the previous night, according to the flight plan filed. The pilot's log indicates that they were returning to the airport, yet there is no record of the plane landing. Could he have gone elsewhere? There are numerous branches of Ryder across the country. He could be anywhere. Hawthorne continued, indicating that they would need to involve the FAA and the FBI. Ryan interjected, suggesting that he had a contact at the local FAA office. We can proceed to the location in question after a search warrant has been executed on order. Hawthorne nodded. What is the next step? Hawthorne stated that his team would complete their work and free the body of Ryan's wife within several days. They would also detain the individuals in the video and question them further. I nodded in understanding. Ryan then requested a private conversation with West. Hawthorne nodded in agreement. I understand, he said. I still need to make a couple of calls. I'll be right outside. He looked at me before continuing, I'm really sorry about all this, Mr. West. He told me, thank you, detective. After he left, Ryan turned back to me. Mr. West, Tom, he began. I wanted to talk to you a little about what happened to my wife, and I felt it was preferable to discuss the matter in private. I am grateful for your understanding, Ryan. However, I will spare you the gory details. From what I have read and seen, the last 48 hours were absolute hell. I spoke to a medical examiner in the East, who confirmed my suspicions. I do not believe your wife would have agreed with what was done to her. I believe she was brutally attacked. The victim was subjected to exploitation and abuse by a group of individuals driven by a desire for power and control. I understand your objective, Ryan, and I appreciate your efforts. However, it is important to note that Katie and Henderson had been in a relationship for approximately 1 month prior to the incident. The precise circumstances surrounding their relationship remain unclear, but it is probable that Katie could have prevented this outcome. He did not take action at any point prior to last Friday. The rationale behind her decision remains unclear, and the opportunity to gain insight into her thought process has now been lost. I understand, Ryan said quietly, as he retrieved a business card from his pocket and extended it to me. I believe you should consult with Tom. Dr. Harmon is one of the most esteemed professionals in the field. You may wish to contact her directly. I will do so. Thank you. I expressed my concern about Henderson. It is likely that the perpetrators will return, he said. I would assign a couple of officers to you, but we simply do not have the manpower for this. However, I will order the dispatcher to double patrols in your area. Do you have a firearm? No, he replied. Immediately call 911. I informed Ryan, who had just returned to the house. I had just concluded a telephone conversation with Ryan's partner, Johnson. Johnson informed me that he is wanted throughout the country and has also received search warrants. He is currently awaiting our arrival. Ryan nodded his head and stood up. We will maintain communication. Tom. Ryan shook my hand and said, we will keep in touch. His hand, I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. West. He said, thank you, detective. I said, after they left, my parents came back and sat down. Are you going to be okay? I think so, my father replied. I have a couple more calls to make, and I'm looking forward to them in many ways. This was true. I needed to tell Jim what happened to his mother, and I also needed to. I was compelled to contact Katie's parents. If you require anything, do not hesitate to contact us, I told him. I will do that, he replied. We exchanged hugs and observed them as they departed. I proceeded to call Jim on his mobile phone and left a voicemail. I anticipated that he would not call me back for some considerable time. I was not at all eager for our next conversation. Kathy's father, Bill Anderson, was a retired Marine colonel, a highly decorated combat veteran who earned the nickname Bloody Bill during a tour in Afghanistan. I was not privy to the specifics of his actions, but from what I heard, he allegedly killed several Taliban fighters armed only with a knife. I observed him in uniform on several occasions, and the men had more ribbons and medals than I had ever seen on a military man was present in my life. He and Katie's mother, Alice, relocated to the country house several years ago following his departure from the army. The colonel, as we collectively referred to him, did not engage in any harmful actions. I must admit that I was somewhat apprehensive about informing him that his only child had passed away. Fortunately, we had a cordial relationship, and he requested that I address him as Dad. I took a moment to collect myself and proceeded to dial the number. I proceeded to dial the number for Anderson's residence. Upon hearing Bill's voice on the other end of the line, I inquired about his well-being. He responded by asking if I was okay. I informed him that I was not, as he had the audacity to sound like someone had taken all of his cookies. I then proceeded to explain that I had just returned from the hospital, where I had learned of Katie's demise. Bill was visibly shocked and inquired about my whereabouts at the hospital. Hospital, is that where she died? What the hell happened? It's a little difficult. I said it's difficult, I replied. What do you mean difficult? He asked. I gave him a brief summary of the situation, and he appeared to take a moment to process the information. After a few moments, he spoke again. We will be there at 16, he said. It's 4 cow p.m. For those unacquainted with the intricacies of military protocol, I informed my father that I would ensure he had freshly brewed coffee upon his arrival. He responded that he would do so. We concluded the call, and I sat back in my chair, contemplating the events that had transpired. In a sudden rush of emotion, I became overwhelmed with a profound sense of loss, and I began to sob. I felt as if I had lost everything that mattered to me. I had lost everything that held any significant meaning for me. My marriage had evidently been in a state of dissolution for some time, and I was not aware of it. Now, the only woman I had ever truly loved was also gone. Despite my hatred of her actions, I did not want her to die. In contrast, the situation with Henderson was entirely different. I arose from bed and consumed nourishment. I consumed some of my mother's lasagna, which has historically provided me with a sense of comfort. This instance proved to be no exception. Following my repast, I proceeded to tidy up and take a leisurely stroll around the house, reflecting on my life with Katie. Every nook and cranny in this dwelling held memories for me. Given the circumstances, I was unable to remain in this house. I resolved that, once this matter was concluded, I would sell the property and procure a smaller residence. I located Katie's mobile phone on the bedside table, still connected to the charger. I elected to ascertain whether it might contain information that would elucidate the motivation behind her actions. The device was locked, but I was aware of the 4-digit code she had used to protect it. I entered the digit code she had used. It transpired that several calls had been received by her phone from Henderson and from the work number of Brenda, which had been used on the previous Friday. I perused her text messages and discovered a conversation with Henderson from a couple of months ago, but there really the context was limited, and the messages were brief. It was unclear whether they were discussing matters of importance or merely exchanging pleasantries. I also examined her emails, but they did not yield any indications of wrongdoing. I then turned off the phone and placed it back on the bedside table, noting that it was already 3 o'clock. It was 4:55 p.m. At 3:45 p.m., I realized that I had spent a considerable amount of time examining Katie's phone. Given the colonel's strict punctuality, I proceeded to the kitchen and prepared a fresh pot of coffee, brewed to his exact specifications. Just as the digital clock on the coffee pot displayed 4 p.m., the doorbell rang. I recognized the colonel's voice at the door, so I opened it and invited him and Alice inside. "Son, didn't anyone ever teach you to duck?" the colonel asked, noting my expression. My father had attempted to instill such knowledge, but I believe I never fully grasped it. I responded with a light-hearted, "Come in," as they entered the house. Another vehicle pulled into the driveway and stopped. I observed a tall, lanky man exit the car. A man exited the vehicle and proceeded towards the entrance. Bill inquired, "I hope you don't mind," after relaying the information he had previously shared. He had contacted the authorities for assistance. By this time, the man, who was tall and lanky, had already entered the residence with a laptop bag on his shoulder. He was carrying 2 additional bags, which prompted Bill to question the situation. He then introduced the men as Ron, his brother. This is Tom West, he said. Tom, this is Ron Wiseman. We served together in the Corps. Nice to meet you, Mr. Wiseman, I said, shaking his hand. Please call me Ron, he said. He smiled as he set his bags down on the floor. I'm a little more than that, he said. I'm doing some work for a special task force and I happen to have access to information that, from what the colonel said, will be very useful. Very well, I said. Please, sit down, and I'll go get us all some coffee. Alice joined me in the kitchen, and we returned with 4 large cups of coffee. The colonel liked it hot, fresh, and black. Alice handed him the cup, and he took a tentative sip before placing it on the table. He then stated, "Not bad," to Tom. He then requested, "Why don't you bring us all up to speed?" I informed them of the events that transpired up until Ryan and Hawthorne departed from the residence earlier. You have video recordings, I was told. They are rather unsightly, I replied. I would still like to see them, he said. I assured him that I would not be offended. After 30 years, he replied. In the Corps, there is a plethora of experiences that Alice and I have collectively encountered. I proceeded to retrieve my mobile device and initiated the playback of the video. The 4 videos were viewed in their entirety before the device was returned. It was evident that Bill and Alice were profoundly distressed by the content. Conversely, Ron demonstrated a remarkable capacity to compartmentalize the incident, intermittently pausing the video to obtain a more detailed examination of the individuals involved. It is evident that she had been drugged. Alice corroborated this assertion, and Ron concurred, although the specifics remain uncertain. I informed her that Brenda Henderson's assistant had stated he was developing a new form of ecstasy, which he referred to as super ecstasy. Ron then asked, "Did Henderson drug you too?" I replied in the affirmative, but by the time I was treated in the hospital, the substance had by this time, Ron had already initiated the download of the video by entering the password for his home wireless network and connecting to the internet. I then proceeded to open one of the videos and pause it, allowing Ron to closely examine the footage. Harvey Strauss. I then directed my attention to Lenny Jameson, the 2 large men depicted in the video. I inquired as to whether he could send me the videos. Ron then provided me with his email address. I informed him that I would forward the videos to him. Ron then confirmed that he had received the files and proceeded to work on them. Ron then revealed that the men in the video were not their actual names. I inquired as to what their names were. Ron then informed me that they were former associates. The perpetrators, who have been at large for approximately 2 years, are believed to have been involved in the murder of their superior, James Brolin, also known as Jimmy the Weasel. The federal authorities have been searching for them since the crime was committed. Ron inquired as to whether I was suggesting that the individuals in question had placed Henderson on a nationwide wanted list. I confirmed this hypothesis and he proceeded to initiate a search for further information. He then suggested that we take a brief recess and resume the conversation at a later point. After a period of discussion, the colonel agreed that Ron would remain at the location until the aforementioned individuals were no longer active. He expressed concern about the potential risks associated with the agent's presence alone and highlighted the ongoing threat posed by the remaining individuals. He instructed Ron to notify him immediately should any developments arise. The agent agreed to this arrangement. I understand, Colonel. Ron replied. What are your intentions? I have no intention of divulging any information to you, Bill replied. Let's just say that we Marines are capable of taking care of ourselves. You said you would be on sick leave until Monday. I informed him of my intentions to resign from the military 2 weeks in advance of my scheduled return to active duty on Monday. Additionally, I am planning to sell my current residence and purchase a smaller property. He expressed understanding. Regarding the anticipated time frame for the release of Katie's body, it is possible that several days have elapsed since Hawthorne informed me. In the event that assistance is required with final preparations, we would be grateful if you could provide it. Thank you, Dad. I appreciate it. He said, Ron, please inform me as soon as you learn of any developments. I will do so. Bill turned to me and surprised me with a fatherly embrace. In all the years I had known him, I had never seen him hug another man. Everything will be fine, son, he said. Alice moved closer when he released me and embraced me gently. I am truly sorry for your loss, Tom, she said. Please do not worry about anything. I will not. Thank you for coming, Mom, I replied. You are welcome. Please call if you require anything, she said. My phone rang shortly after they left the house. I saw that the number was Jim's. I answered the phone and sat down next to him. I informed him of the circumstances surrounding the incident. Initially, he was taken aback by this information. Dad, that just doesn't seem like something she could do, he said. I know it doesn't make any sense to me either, I replied. There is no evidence of such a device. Perhaps she has one that she has discarded. A disposable phone, perhaps. That is a possibility. Have you considered the videos she sent you? The call originated from a number I did not recognize. It is possible that it was her burner phone. If that is the case, then it is unlikely that anyone will be able to ascertain her location. You may have identified a promising lead. I did not consider that possibility previously. We discussed the matter further and concluded the conversation with Jim requesting that I inform him of the time of her funeral. After the call, I proposed the idea of using a burner phone to Ron. He agreed that it was a viable approach and said that he would investigate further if I provided him with the number. I provided him with the number and he proceeded to enter it into a program. He then had the answer within a few minutes. The number belonged to a phone bot is here in the city, he said, as anticipated. This is a burner phone. The number is registered to Ryder and was last identified on Tuesday morning in NYC. There has been no activity on it since the last video was received. Do you have any idea where he might be now? I asked. None, he said. As far as we know. The device was dismantled and its components were discarded in the river. The individual in question returned to his computer, so I prepared a guest room for him, as I was uncertain about the length of his stay. He remained with me on Saturday, spending the majority of his time on the computer. I was unaware of his activities. We have, however, become better acquainted since his arrival on Wednesday. He informed me that he had served as a sniper in the Marines and is currently employed by a joint federal private task force. Despite being a certified public accountant, the majority of his work was related to research. He provided me with a brief overview of his professional background. Furthermore, he revealed that Amy had been involved in a relationship with other executives who sought to assert their own preferences. I was uncertain as to the veracity of his statements, yet the anecdotes he shared were intriguing. The night before, he inquired if I would object to Amy joining him for the weekend. I granted his request, and she arrived at approximately 9 a.m. On the morning in question, the time was approximately 9 a.m. On Saturday morning, after an initial introduction, Ron and Amy relocated Amy's belongings to the guest room. I then excused myself to the garage, where I spent approximately an hour engaged in some personal tasks. Upon returning to the house, I observed Ron and Amy seated in front of his computer, apparently viewing something of interest. Ron acknowledged my presence with a glance. I then inquired as to whether there were any new developments. Ron responded in the affirmative and proceeded to relay the following information. Firstly, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, has assumed control of the investigation, and secondly, approximately 30 minutes ago, a confident hit was made on our targets, all of whom are currently located in the vicinity of Colorado Springs. I then asked whether there was anything else he wished to share. Ron replied that he had already contacted the commanding officer, who would undoubtedly be able to resolve the matter independently. However, he did mention that there was something else. What, then, is this? I inquired. I was able to view the official autopsy report on your wife, he replied. What, precisely, is written there, according to the report, that indicates your wife suffered a massive heart attack from the chemicals Henderson administered to her? I asked. That is not, in fact, the cause of death, Ron replied. They also found soil particles in. What does it mean that her lungs were affected? I inquired. She was alive when they buried her, Ron replied. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. She was barely alive, but alive nonetheless. That's not all, I said, taken aback. There was also extensive bruising around her private parts, and a toxicology report showed huge amounts of. A range of chemicals were identified in her blood, including ecstasy and cocaine. It is difficult to comprehend how she could have endured such a brutal ordeal in the final hours of her life. It is implausible that she would have done so voluntarily. What is your hypothesis regarding the circumstances of her death? I inquired. From what I have read, it is probable that Henderson and his associates engaged in a significant and excessive celebration. He replied. Your wife was so excited about what Henderson gave her that she was unable to control herself. At some point, she suffered a fatal heart attack. Instead of taking her to a hospital where she might have survived, her companions likely believed she was already deceased. Consequently, they carried her out and buried her. I was deeply affected by what Ron had just told me. Ron informed me that Amy had come over and embraced me, her eyes streaming with tears. Henderson and his associates are currently sought for charges including murder, conspiracy to commit murder, manufacture and use of a number of controlled substances, and racketeering, among other offenses. Ron stated that the other individuals featured in the videos have already been apprehended. The police have apprehended and formally accused Henderson, but it is clear that he is the primary target of the investigation. It is difficult to predict the ultimate outcome of this case. I inquired about the probable fate of Henderson with Ron shrugged. He acknowledged that it is challenging to anticipate the judicial process in the current climate. I awoke the following morning at 4 a.m. to a phone call. The time is 30 a.m. It was 4:30 in the morning. I was curious as to who might be contacting me at such an unconventional hour. I answered the call and heard a male voice instructing me to check my text messages. The voice then terminated the call, and I could discern that the caller had concealed his identity by masking his voice and not leaving a contact number. I accessed my text messages and discovered a video attachment. I observed 3 men who were naked and tied hand and foot. They were unceremoniously dumped in front of a brick building. I recognized them as Henderson, Lenny, and Harvey. A sign was hung around Henderson's neck that read, "Memo to the FBI. I killed Katie West." I wondered if the FBI would obtain any information from the video. I finished watching the video. I retired once more to slumber, emerging 4 hours later and descending to the kitchen. Amy was preparing bacon and eggs for the 3 of us. "I hope you don't mind me attempting to utilize your kitchen," she said. "Ron becomes quite displeased if he doesn't get his bacon in the morning." "I do as well," I replied. "I become somewhat irritable when I don't." I proceeded to obtain the bacon, which she graciously permitted me to assist in preparing. Once she had concluded her task, we all sat down to breakfast. We had just finished when there was a knock on the door. I opened it and saw Ryan standing there. He inquired as to whether he could come in, to which I replied in the affirmative and invited him inside. I then introduced him to Ron and Amy, informing him that they were friends of my father. "Would you care for a cup of coffee or something else?" I inquired. "No, thank you," he replied. "Tom, I won't be staying here for long," he said. "I just wanted to let you know that Henderson and 2 of his top associates were taken into custody in Colorado Springs early this morning." "That's good news, isn't it?" I inquired. "Yes," he replied. "I have been informed that they are vocalizing their cooperation." "Have there been any developments regarding the circumstances of their apprehension?" I asked. "There have been a few inquiries regarding that matter, but I am confident that you are not privy to any information regarding it." "I have been here the entire night," I stated. "Ron and Amy can corroborate this." "I just wanted you to be aware," he said. "Now, I'll leave you to it. Take care of yourself." "Thank you, Ryan," I replied. After he left, I looked at Ron. "Do you know anything about this?" I asked. "Don't ask me questions," he replied, "and I won't lie to you." I thanked him and informed him of the situation. Anderson Bill said, "Dad, I just wanted you to know that the police came to see me." I replied, "I was told that Henderson and his associate were detained in Colorado Springs, which is good news." I expressed my gratitude, and he inquired as to whether he was responsible. I confirmed that he was indeed the perpetrator. He then asked if I had any further information, to which I replied in the affirmative. He then expressed his appreciation and said, "You're welcome, son." He then asked if I had received a phone call the previous night. I confirmed that I had, and he commented that it was an effective tactic to include that information in the sign. He then asked if I thought that information might have provided them with a clue. I replied that I was hopeful that it might have done so. "We will speak again soon, son. Take care of yourself." "I will do so, Father." The following Monday, I went to work and submitted my resignation. Colleagues expressed regret at my departure but understood my reasons. I then consulted a realtor about selling the house. I was aware that I had a significant workload ahead of me. We have lived in this house since our marriage, and it has accumulated memories and belongings over 2 decades. Another week passed before the medical examiner in New York released Katie's body, as promised. Her parents took. I was ambivalent about attending the funeral. On the one hand, I had loved her exclusively for over 2 decades and felt a profound sense of loss. On the other hand, I was troubled by her actions at the end. I found myself questioning whether her death was truly the result of the drugs Henderson had given her, or if there were other factors at play. It was unclear whether the drugs Henderson had given her were the cause of death or if there was another factor involved. I ultimately decided to attend the funeral for reasons related to my relationship with Bill and Alice. They had been kind to me, and I felt a sense of obligation to honor their memory. Jim was able to take a few days off from West Point to attend the funeral. It was a positive experience to reconnect with him, and we collectively mourned Katie's demise, recalling the pleasant memories we shared as a family unit. I chose not to divulge the circumstances surrounding her death, as he had always been close to his mother and I deemed it unnecessary to taint his memories of her. Once this was accomplished, I consulted with an attorney regarding the potential filing of a lawsuit against Ryder. It was unclear how far this would go, but the lawyer I spoke with seemed to believe that a strong case could be made against Henderson and the board of directors, particularly given that they were all facing multiple criminal charges. The proceedings lasted for an extensive period of time, and the U.S. attorney in charge of the case sought the death penalty for Henderson. The defense team filed a multitude of motions, many of which were without merit. I provided testimony and observed the proceedings, and I also listened as others presented their evidence. Brenda also took the witness stand and informed the jury that Jake had drugged other women as well. Furthermore, she was used as a sex toy. When directly asked, she stated that she was not 100% certain if Katie and Henderson were engaged in an affair prior to that fateful weekend. Video footage obtained from a search of Henderson's office appeared to indicate that Kathy had rejected the majority of Henderson's initial advances. However, it became evident that over time, she began to gradually accept the idea of. The search of the office and residence also uncovered evidence that he was experimenting with drugs. However, the expert witnesses did not fully understand the effects of the drugs he had manufactured. Nevertheless, they all stated that the majority of the compounds he had formulated were intended to be used as date rape drugs. Through the testimony, I finally learned what it was revealed that Henderson had been sustaining Katie with drugs and alcohol for the majority of the weekend. At one point, she experienced severe chest pain and collapsed to the floor, unconscious. The men informed Jor that they had checked on her but could not find a pulse. Instead of taking her to the nearest hospital, which was only a few minutes away, after cleaning her up, they assumed she was dead and placed her in the trunk of a car, subsequently transporting her to Central Park, where they buried her. When questioned by the U.S. attorney, none of those involved could provide any training in CPR and none were qualified to offer a medical opinion. Their fate was sealed when a medical examiner stated that soil was found in her. The lung tissue samples matched those found in the soil where she was buried. In other words, the medical examiner informed the jury that she had been buried alive. Some of the jury members expressed shock when he made this statement. At the conclusion of the trial, Jake, his 2 accomplices, and all those involved in the weekend party were found guilty of all charges. The judge opted not to impose the death penalty and instead sentenced Jake to life imprisonment, along with Lenny. Additionally, Harvey and the remaining defendants were incarcerated, albeit with somewhat lenient sentences. Following the conclusion of the criminal proceedings, civil lawsuits against Ryder and Henderson were filed in their entirety. By the time the legal battle was over, the company had lost the vast majority of its customers and was placed in receivership. Henderson was compelled to pay me a substantial sum of money. Ultimately, the consequences of Henderson's actions were far more significant than he had anticipated. Not only was Katie deceased, but he and his accomplices were also bankrupt and incarcerated. Additionally, his company essentially ceased to exist, leaving hundreds of individuals unemployed. In contrast, my life continued, and I eventually sold the house and purchased a new 2-bedroom apartment. I felt a pang of sadness when I closed the door to the house for the last time and handed over the keys to the new owner. However, I was optimistic about the future, and I had the rest of my life ahead of me. My consultant suggested that I take some time off and perhaps go on a nice cruise where I could meet a nice young woman. I decided to do just that. I embarked on a round-the-world cruise, having purchased my tickets in advance. I took a taxi to the airport, then proceeded to Miami and subsequently visited numerous other countries. It is unclear what I might have discovered had I not been so preoccupied with my own affairs. To avoid similar misfortune, I would advise you to subscribe to our channel. I will now proceed to recount the next story, which is of a more intriguing nature than the previous one.